Moving on to something different, The Rings of Power Season 2. I did a first impressions on my thoughts of The Rings of Power Season 2 a few weeks ago when we got the first 3 episodes. You can go and check that out if you haven't already. My main thoughts on The Rings of Power, like it's setting it, bringing that conversation around the fact that this is one of Amazon's biggest ever shows. It's one of the biggest productions ever made. Season 1 was an interesting exercise. It was a series to me that felt a little bit burdened by this mystery box format of who is Sauron. But now we've come into Season 2. The story is very much shifted. We know who Sauron is. Halbrand, who was the sort of dark horse of the first season, has now been revealed as Sauron. He is in his elf-like as Anatar the Deceiver. He is manipulating all of the different races of Middle-earth, trying to get them to ultimately accept Rings of Power. And finally, the title of the series of the show starts to really make sense. The Rings of Power in the show are the ultimate, driving factor. Yeah. They're the MacGuffins, literally, in the purest sense. Everyone is or isn't putting them on, and that is greatly affecting the story of this. I think the first half of the series, my first impressions, were kind of burdened with the criticism I'd had of Season 1, which is that this series, though beautifully shot and entertaining and cozy, it's very cozy, it very rarely held me in suspense. And I think if you and I were to do an exercise where we watched this series together on that sofa once a week, I think it'd be the kind of thing where, especially for the first half of this series, the credits would roll and you and I would go, all right, and then we'd get on with something else. And I think there's very little that you and I would want to digest on. It wasn't necessarily challenging me. But here's how I was sort of approaching Rings of Power. It was my very cozy autumnal, get some soup, flick it on, the beautiful Bear McCreary Hans Zimmer score swelling, and it's Tolkien and Middle-earth, and it's all just gorgeous. And I had a really nice 1 episode here, 2 episodes there, soft spot for it in my sort of late Sunday evenings. And I still had the same problems with, I want to say, the first 4 or 5 episodes of this 8-episode season, where I'd get to the end and I'd be like, yeah, it's fine, it's cool. You know what's really working? The orcs all look brilliant. The cinematography is really good. I'd say the series looks really expensive and the dialogue's great until all of a sudden it just isn't. There's a couple of crowd scenes where someone's like, yeah, we think that. And I'm like, oh, I am watching a TV show. But something really happened to me from episode 5 to 8 where I felt like this series just all of a sudden snapped into focus in the best way. And what I was so pleased to say happened was there was brilliant payoff. I kept thinking like payoff. And not just, crucially, for people who already love The Lord of the Rings. There were some of those, but there were specific moments of payoff between characters set up in this show that came back together, or moments that would come back to. And I was like, yes, that is something that was really missing from Season 1. And I've watched 2 seasons of this show, and that's a moment where I went, oh, brilliant. Yes, fantastic. And then there's also that thing for me who's a fan of the Lord of the Rings books and films. I was like, brilliant. That's just what this show has been missing, and it's there. I want to give a special shout out to Charlie Vickers, who plays Sauron, or Anatar. I think he's actually got a really difficult job to do, being this villain who previously hasn't really had a voice in The Lord of the Rings or the films, but does a really great job of manipulating Celebrimbor, who's the high elf, who's like the master craftsman, who is designing and building all of the Rings of Power, and how he uses manipulation to get what he needs from different people and Galadriel. I think it's just really well done, and he's slimy, but also just very evocative, and I just think he handles that role, which I think could be quite difficult, really well. And there's a battle scene towards the end, which I think really sort of carries the action. And yes, there were stakes, there were consequences, and just a lot of my problems with it until like mid part of Season 2 were kind of rectified. And I'm now sitting here saying, do you know what? That show establishes itself as a solid piece of TV in my mind, and I'm now I wanted more. I'm looking forward to Season 3. I think it's really well done. And I will just say the CG and the special effects, especially the opening of the finale and some other moments in between, whether it was a CG monster or a practical monster, I just thought looked brilliant. Wow. It was as good as, if not better than, most of the stuff we see in the highest budget filmmaking. I just thought, fantastic. That CG, that monster looks nasty and brilliant. That whole moment was just brilliantly done. Fantastic. It's what you wanted from my mind's eye of a Tolkien show when they announced Rings of Power.
I'm happy for you. I'm actually glad. I'm glad to hear that, because it's a bit like we talked on the main show with Joker 2. Like, we do want it to find its audience, particularly when you're dealing with a huge IP, a very famous IP that you want to be honour the audience that you're drawing from. Great. I'm glad it's finally. I mean, it's not a sell for me to be like,
and it might
stick
not
with
be
it for 2 seasons.
Ultimately, it is a stick with it for 2 seasons for it to go good.
But I'm glad that like all that money and all that time and all that prestige and all the things that Amazon put into it pay off.
I'm not exactly. Yeah, I'm still not. I would say majorly challenged by its ideas, but for that type of entertainment, I think it's a really solid one. If you were on the fence about season 2 and you'd see season 1, I would say give it a go, because I think the second half of season 2 in particular is just really entertaining.
I feel like this is what happened to you with the Mandalorian season 3, where it just like towards the end it actually built to a moment. You were like,
sort of last 2 episodes of season 3 of Mandalorian, I'd say were better. Yeah, than the first half. That's true. But yeah, like I think the Stranger storyline with the Harfoots is very slow, and I think it ended in a place that was okay for this season. I still kind of feel like that's, taking its time, but just moments with Elrond and Galadriel, brilliant. Like payoff I didn't expect was brewing in the background happened.
Brilliant.
And that's just like brilliant. That's great fun. I'm having a good time. I look forward to season 3, which I'm really pleased to say.
Oh, excellent. It's turned itself around.
Yeah, definitely. As always. That's why I always say first impressions of season 1. But yeah, the first 4 or 5 episodes. Yeah.
If you have any thoughts on the Rings of Power season 2, please send them in to hello@pulpkitchenpodcast.com. Just like Grace did. Grace wrote in a few weeks ago and said, "Hi, James and George, in defense of Rings of Power. Long-time listener, first-time emailer here. I recently listened to your Rings of Power first impressions, and I thought I might contribute my opinion. I'd forgotten until listening to the pod that Rings of Power was released in the same year as House of the Dragon. That comparison definitely contributed to my initial disappointment with it for the same reasons you mentioned, and I only watched 3 episodes before stopping. However, after seeing a bit of social media buzz around season 2, I've gone back to it this year and I've loved it, even if there was still a bit of a BBC Merlin flavour to some of the writing.
Yeah.
I love all things fantasy, but I've found that I struggle with violence and gore on screen recently, while most fantasy or historical shows follow the HBO model of being quite graphic or grotesque, so it can be difficult to watch. By contrast, I enjoy the relative safety of Rings of Power. It's definitely cosy and comfortable, as you said, but for me, that's a big part of the appeal, and I really value it. I love TV. I love TV that you have to think about, but I also don't think everything needs to be challenging. And Rings of Power, particularly after season 2 of House of the Dragon, which felt exceptionally bleak, it feels very welcome. Also, I see what you mean about it being quite low stakes, as we know where most of the characters will end up, and we're waiting for major story beats we know are coming. But that's arguably the case with every adaptation, not just prequels. If you know the source material, you know what's coming, and the fun is in watching it unfold. Like James, I'm a big Tolkien fan, so seeing more of the world realised on screen with beautifully designed and great score feels like a treat. I do see that the other audiences might not be able to get on with it as much as I am, but I thought I'd offer my thoughts in defence of a show I'm really enjoying, although I'm undecided about the... I've just hummed over that in case it's a huge spoiler. Okay. Finally, just want to say how much I enjoyed the podcast. I've been listening since episode 4.
Whoa!
Wow, you are OG. You're first generation. Yeah. And you've been excellent company on many lunch breaks, car journeys, and walks. Keep doing what you're doing. I wish you continued success with it all. Thank you very much, Grace. Appreciate that.
That is definitely a thing where, like, if you're a little bit clued in, you do know roughly where this is all heading, and that is a problem for most of the season. But it was like from episode 5, all of the things started happening that were show specific. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like you could say that about House of the Dragon, that ultimately we know what's going to happen 300 years later, but the drama within that is specific to the show. And it was like, yes, this is a moment that only you guys have talked about, and this has stakes for that. And it's like, great. Now, and I feel rewarded for having paid attention. And that was really refreshing. But yeah, you are a little bit like, okay, well, there's the 7 rings. But the Rings of Power story in themselves are never really... I don't think it's very clear how Rings of Power affect and manipulate people in Middle-earth to go to Sauron's will. Right. And that is being addressed in this show in a way that's comprehensible. And I'm like, oh, okay, that now fills in the blanks that the original trilogy never really explained. And I like seeing Sauron manipulate people and try and fail and stumble. He's also a little bit flawed. Sauron's also figuring out his own identity, which is kind of interesting because there's another layer to an otherwise quite one-dimensional villain. It's like, yes, flesh it out, go.
Is he like, am I the drama? Am I the bad guy?
Like, I am terrible. I always wondered if, like, because he's in this like elf-like form, and he is like as like he's representing himself in an elf-like form to be what he needs to be to get what he wants from Celebrimbor. I'm always wondering, like, are you waking up in your chambers and getting ready and doing your hair and like just lining it up just right? I now want to see him in his chambers, but that's probably a terrible idea.
Thank you so much for joining us for this bonus episode of Pulp Kitchen. We hope you enjoyed these 2 reviews. Again, if you want to send in your thoughts, send them in to hello@pulpkitchenpodcast.com, and make sure you check out not just episode 149 from this week, but also episode 150, our 150th episode, which will be very special indeed.
Nice.
Thanks so much, guys. Bye. James, wave to them.
Oh, thank you to our producers, Aidan and
Oh,
Finn.
thank you to our producers, Aidan and Finn, as always. We love you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.